Welcome to Module 2 of People-Centered Screening and Assessment. In Module 2, we'll be talking about the Abuse Assessment Screen. At the end of this module, home visiting professionals will be able to understand the context and purpose of conducting an abuse assessment screen, so the why of approaching this important screening and assessment topic. We'll also be able to identify the correct screening protocols and the pitfalls for grantees. People at the end of this module will be able to articulate the values of using this screen with families, and will be able to effectively frame the abuse assessment screen and process it for families and have some tips to refer to. By the end of this module, participants will be able to use the screen with greater intention and effectiveness to strengthen home visiting services and individualized supports to families. In addition, there are some learning objectives that are really focused more towards supervisors. And at the end of the module, supervisors will really be able to consider some tools and strategies to support home visitors in conducting the abuse assessment screen effectively as an integrated and important part of home visiting services. At the end of the modules, you'll notice that there is a tip sheet. You can print that out now or print it out afterward, but the module will closely align to the information on the tip sheets. So here are some quick facts about the tools. The tools were developed by Drs. Wist and McFarlane in 1999, and they wrote an article about it called The Effectiveness of an Abuse Assessment Protocol in Public Health Prenatal Clinics. It was published in the American Journal of Public Health. In this article, the researchers explained how important it is to be looking at screening and assessment. Their intention was to reduce violence against women and provide supports to women who are experiencing violence by asking and responding in a supportive manner to women who identified through the screening and assessment process that they had in fact experienced domestic or intimate partner violence. This tool has 5 questions and a plan of action if someone screens positive. It's available in both English and Spanish, and the initial research included use with Spanish-speaking and English-speaking women. So when using this tool, it's important to do it with intent, and that requires understanding the purpose. Pregnant mothers and mothers of young children are at a significant risk of violence. So it's important to help families understand that the reason why we use this tool is because being a woman with young children is a risk. The Wisconsin Department of Children and Families added this tool to the suite of screens and assessments that are used for state-funded home visiting programs as a response to the high prevalence of violence against women in Wisconsin and the opportunity that home visitors uniquely have through developing and cultivating a supportive relationship with women to create a safe way for mothers to share information about their experiences. So there are some quick facts about violence against women nationally that are important to bear in mind as we engage in screening and assessment around domestic and intimate partner violence in Wisconsin. So 1 in every 4 women in the United States will experience domestic violence in her lifetime. And an estimated 1.3 million women are victims of physical assault by an intimate partner each year. The majority, 73%, of family violence victims are female. And females were 84% of spousal abuse victims and 86% of abuse victims at the hands of a boyfriend. Not only is domestic violence a concern for women, it's also a concern for their children, as there are long-lasting impacts if violence isn't addressed in a supportive way. Boys who witness domestic violence are 2 times as likely to abuse their own partners and children when they become adults as boys who were not witnesses of domestic violence. And 25% or more of same-sex couples experience domestic violence, also known as intimate partner violence, in the United States. It's important to bear in mind that the reason why this program requires people to do screening and assessment around domestic violence is because it can happen to anyone, and it is important to do it universally and to not be making judgment calls about who should and should not be screened, because sometimes people who you wouldn't anticipate having this challenge in their life are in fact currently dealing with it. It's also important to not just understand the national picture, but to understand what's going on in Wisconsin. According to the Wisconsin 2014 to 2020 Long-Range Plan for a Safe Wisconsin, 714,000 Wisconsin women have been physically abused, sexually assaulted, or stalked by an intimate partner since the time that the data started being collected. And we also know that domestic violence victimization leads to a significantly higher risk of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, suicide attempts, and drug abuse. So intervening through a screening that's done in a sensitive, respectful, and culturally competent way can start to turn the tide on these concerning statistics and really bring higher quality and more focused services to the women who are participating in home visiting programs throughout Wisconsin. So it's also important to understand what's going on specifically and what we're learning so far about violence against women from women who have participated already in the Wisconsin Family Foundation's home visiting program. From October 1st, 2014 through November 30th of 2015, 412 out of the 597 women who were eligible to complete the abuse assessment screen did. Sorry, I blew the slide. I need to do this one over too. So there are some quick facts that we should bear in mind about violence against women in the home visiting programs in Wisconsin that are part of the Wisconsin Family Foundation's home visiting. All women who participate in the home visiting program are eligible for an abuse assessment screen. 412 of the 597 women who were eligible to complete the screen did so within the timelines during the 2014-2015 program year. Of the 412 women who were screened on time, 22% of those screened positive for domestic violence. So it's also important to consider why this is a useful tool to families. So by having a conversation with all women who enroll in home visiting services about intimate partner and domestic violence, it reduces the silence and reduces the stigma for folks who are actively experiencing domestic violence or those who have survived it. It's an opportunity for women to give voice to their experiences if they so choose. It's also a trauma-informed service in that it makes a difference in family and child outcomes when people are able to talk about their experiences of trauma and be affirmed for the supports they've received and be affirmed in being given opportunities for additional supports if those are warranted. By connecting people with additional supports and resources, it lets them know that the screening and assessment process is really about finding out what their specific needs are and responding in kind. So how do we do this in the Wisconsin home visiting programs? And there's some important tips that we can keep in mind as a protocol for getting started with the screening and assessment process. It's very important when introducing the abuse assessment screen to be compassionate, open, and respectful when introducing the tool, and to make sure that the person completing the screen can speak freely and safely. What we mean specifically about speaking freely and safely is that the conversation can happen privately. These aren't conversations that make sense to have with children in listening range, and they're also not conversations that make sense to have if somebody's partner is there. So when you check in on safety, you can see if it's a good time. In this way, it's really important to make sure that completing this screening assessment isn't left to the last possible time frame and the last possible visit to get it done, because if there is somebody there that makes it unsafe to complete the screen, then it's important that you put the safety of the woman ahead of meeting a timeline. So you have to make sure that the screening process is conversational, unhurried, and delivered calmly. If it's delivered in a way that is rote, that is hurried, and that's delivered with an edge, then that has a parallel effect on the person who's being screened and may also make them reply in a rote way, in a hurried way, or in an anxious or shut down way. So make sure that we're bringing our best selves to this process as well. It's also important to bear in mind what you already know about the family that you're working with. And while it's important to use this screen universally and not to pick and choose who you'll complete it with or who you won't complete it with, that doesn't mean that even if you're doing it universally that you don't recall and you don't bring to light your knowledge if you're aware already of an abuse history that exists. So it takes a lot of courage for women and all survivors to tell their story. So you can honor that story if it's been shared already or was shared in an intake process, and say something to the effect of, hey, I know that you've already shared some information about abuse that you've experienced in your life, and I really appreciate that you shared that story. I have a responsibility to complete this screen with you to make sure that I haven't overlooked something important that's happened in your life. And so, with your permission, I'd like to go through this screen together. It's important that you record the responses and determine if there is a positive or negative screen. You should not leave a copy of the materials in the home of the screen, as this can increase risk. The way that it may increase risk is if that screening tool is found by a partner, it may raise questions and repercussions in terms of escalated tension, stress, and perhaps even violence. So for the safety of the mom and for the well-being of this work, it's important that you not leave a copy. In addition, it's important to address those safety issues immediately if a current threat exists. And if that's the case, then you build a safety plan. There's more information in this module on building a safety plan. This is simply just a placeholder and a reminder in the screening protocol that when there's a need, that need needs to be addressed, at least in part, during the visit in which that need is disclosed. So it's important during that process to carefully explore the danger that exists, and if the family is open, provide a warm handoff to a community resource if needed. In order to fulfill this piece of the protocol, there's some pre-work that needs to be done, which is to make sure that all home visitors understand and have built some level of relationship, and hopefully a friendly professional relationship, with people who deliver domestic violence services in the community. Handoffs tend to be received better and have better follow-through if providers have great confidence in who they're making the referral to, and if that confidence is conveyed to the family who you're requesting follows up. On the other hand, if the threat isn't immediate, but the person needs additional mental health support, it makes sense to inquire with the person about their needs for ongoing support, and if they're interested, to provide that warm handoff to the community referral. So after the screen has been completed and there's been the discussion about the screening results and additional needs for support, it's also important to enter that data into Sphere. Another key thing to bear in mind is that in order to stay in compliance with the state protocols for grantees, the tool should be completed within 60 days of enrollment, and the follow-up on the plan of action needs to be completed within 60 days of completion of the abuse assessment screen. Now bear in mind that the plan of action should be completed within 60 days. It should be initiated at that visit. So while it's pretty straightforward to deliver this screen, it's also important to bear in mind that there are pitfalls. So there are also some potential pitfalls that should be kept in mind when delivering this screen. One is to be very careful not to assume that you know how someone will react to the screen. When we say, oh, she's not going to want to do this, she's going to find this annoying or intrusive, when we go into a screening process with that attitude, we can set a tone that puts people on edge, which is annoying, or causes reactions because people are stressed. So by following the protocol and addressing it in a calm and straightforward and professional manner, we can ease the possibility of negative reactions. It's also important to keep in mind that people are not necessarily ready or resistant to talk about abuse. So provide an introduction to the screening tool before jumping into it, to figure out if they're ready, to figure out what information they would need to have answered to be ready. We also have to be careful about assumptions about people who are in same-sex relationships. Violence can happen in same-sex relationships, and in fact we know from the previous statistics that were shared in this module that they happen frequently. So please do complete screens related to intimate partner violence with same-sex couples as well. It's also important to keep in mind that even if we have some discomfort in having a conversation about domestic violence, that it's not acceptable to have a screen on paper only and just hand it to people and ask them to please fill this out. So if a person elects to complete the screen on their own and then have a conversation about it after they have filled in the screen themselves, that's one thing, and that's an acceptable practice and a good practice. On the other hand, giving people the screen without a conversation on the front end to explain what it is, and without a conversation on the back end to discuss results, is not a best practice. Again, it would be a significant pitfall and one that would put the family at greater risk to leave a screen or safety plan in an unsafe place. Finally, don't wait until you're entering the data into Sphere to determine if it's a positive or negative screen. Remember that the protocol requires finding out whether they've screened positive or negative during that home visit. So, what are all the elements of completing the abuse assessment screen, and why would we do it? One of the most important things that we can do is complete the screen in a way that strengthens your progress with the family and the family's progress on their own goals. So, one of the great things about the abuse assessment screen is that it supports safety planning. If you're not aware of the issue or the severity of the issue, then it's really hard to have a conversation that brings supports about it. It may not be the most common thing somebody would bring up in a general conversation about goals. So by having an intentional conversation early in the home visiting relationship, when a family is recently enrolled within that 60-day window, it gives you an opportunity to assess family safety right away. In addition, by having a conversation about something that is sensitive and important and getting the issue out in the open, it can reduce barriers that might otherwise be attributed to something else. In addition, it also builds trust by having a non-judgmental, open, supportive conversation with appropriate follow-up. The message is sent loud and clear to families that they can trust you and that this is truly a relationship of partnership. Finally, an important area where conducting the abuse assessment screen can strengthen a home visitor's progress with a family is in terms of contextualizing family goal setting. By understanding a family's trauma history, the home visitor will have additional insight into the parent's goals. Also, by the family gaining a greater understanding of their trauma history, it also helps them to have a context for their goals. When we understand the lived experience is that women and families have had, it can explain some of the barriers that may be creating challenges for a family to achieve their goals. Again, by contextualizing that family goal, we can understand that the procedural memories that people have related to their experiences of abuse shape and influence how they approach decision making and goal setting and tasks in their life. So home visitors can be more intentional about the parent education strategies that they use when they understand a person's trauma history. So in the protocol, it was made clear that it's important to introduce the abuse assessment prior to either passing the paper or completing the screening tool together. And so some important things to keep in mind is that screens can be a valuable strategy to support a family's motivation to make positive changes. That when we tend to a family's need around safety with compassion, openness, transparency, and in a way that reinforces their autonomy during a screening process, it can strengthen the family's motivation to make positive changes in their life without the home visitor falling into the trap of trying to convince a family what to do. It allows people to see themselves in a way that they may not have seen themselves or described themselves in their situations before. There are some prompts that are provided upcoming in the module that allow home visitors to think about ways to frame the abuse assessment screen with families. But these prompts are not meant to be talking points that should be memorized. Rather, they're meant as a guide about how to develop effective communication with families and how to approach sensitive conversations. So, it's really important when doing screening and assessment to alleviate some of the worry and stress that folks have about answering questions that are of a more personal nature. When you introduce a tool, it's important to let them know that you're not singling them out for this screen. Statements such as, many families face challenges, so we ask everyone about how they've been treated in their relationships. I'd like to show you this screening tool that we use so that way we better understand where all families that we're working with are coming from, and more importantly, how I understand where you're coming from. Another important message to convey when introducing the screen is compassion. And we might say something along the lines of, I really want to understand you and your family's history and needs so that I'm able to offer services to meet the needs of what's unique about your family. By conveying that compassion, by showing that there is a value to completing the screen and that your intention is to really understand them better, to get where they're coming from, it sends a strong message of compassion. Another way to approach the introduction of the tool is to be very open and clear. Transparency matters, particularly to folks who have not always had the experience of trusting partnerships, either with professionals or in their personal lives. So one way to approach that issue of transparency is to be straightforward and to the point, and here's an example. We ask these questions to all families we work with because often what parents experience in their own childhood can influence what happens or how they feel when they raise children of their own. By better understanding what's going on or what's happened in your life, we can better work together so you can meet your goals. So, remember back to the first module when we were talking about motivational interviewing spirit and the importance of autonomy in the screening and assessment process. So one way to think about autonomy again is about keeping families in the driver's seat. So a way that you can do that is by giving options back to the family of any process that you're trying to engage in during the home visit. Here's one way to do it. I'm going to go through some questions with you about difficult experiences that you may or may not have had. And if you want to talk more about what a question means, let me know. We can do that. And if there's a question that you'd prefer not to answer, let me know and we can skip it. This is really set up to be a screen that's for your benefit, and I know that you're the best judge of what's of benefit to you. So sometimes there's a lot of fear on the part of somebody who's been experiencing domestic or intimate partner violence about getting in trouble for what's happening in their home. And victims may be internalizing the fear around that, and that may be part of their silence. So if that's the case, then it's important to be very, very clear about what is and what is not reportable. And here's some suggested language, and again, really encourage you to find language of your own that conveys the same message but is authentic to who you are and how you operate with families. So here's the example. This screen, like everything you share with me, is confidential. This means that what you share with me is not reportable to child welfare or law enforcement. There are just two things that I would have to report: if you are suicidal or your children are being harmed. This allows me to support your safety, and I hope that we can move forward with the conversation.
Hi Sophia, it's good to see you again.
Nice to meet you again, Elizabeth.
Yeah, so I noticed that Lorenzo's playing a lot this morning.
Yeah, he's been doing pretty good. He's starting to want to crawl.
Great. Well, I've really been looking forward to meeting you. You know, at our last meeting, we talked about going through a screening tool today, and I'm wondering if now's a good time to do that, or if you'd like to touch bases more about how things are going with your goals and then do the screen later.
I'd like to try out the tool.
Okay, excellent. So what we're going to be talking about, I'm going to give you a copy of it too. And what we're going to be doing is thinking about kind of your own family's history. So I know that when you did intake, you had a chance to tell our intake worker, Janie, a little bit about your family. And I know that I've got a chance to get to know about you more. But, you know, we've been meeting for a couple of months, and I just want to make sure I really know who you are and what's going on for you, so that way I can be most helpful. Does that sound okay?
That sounds fair.
Great. And so it's up to you. We can either go through each question by question, or you can go through it yourself first, and then we can talk about it. What do you prefer?
To be honest, I think I'd rather do it together.
All right, let's do that.
Now that you've watched the screen being introduced, I want you to consider what are some strengths of how the abuse assessment screen was introduced. Jot down some things that you really saw working well in the way it was introduced. Were there ways that MI spirit was alive and well in a way that you could notice? Was it done in a way that was affirming? Was it done in a way that was non-judgmental? Was it introduced in a way that was transparent and open and put the parent, rightfully so, in the driver's seat? Was there accurate empathy conveyed? If you notice those things happening in the video, jot them down and think about how you yourself can convey those same messages when you're introducing the abuse assessment screen. As you're reflecting on that last clip, also consider what else you might add to strengthen how the abuse assessment screen is offered. The next slide shows part of the discussion around the abuse assessment screen.
So this tool specifically looks at what your experience has been with violence in your life. And we're looking at throughout your whole life. And so what I want you to do is know that when we're going through this, if you have any questions, please, I can clarify. You have the option, if there's something that you don't feel like answering, you certainly don't have to. So you're in the driver's seat. You get to decide what you want to share, what you don't want to share. That's really up to you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And we ask this of everybody that we work with, so I'm not just only asking you, anybody we work with, we want to get to know more about you in this way, because we know that a lot of women experience violence in their lives, and it has an impact on who we are, our families, and so that's why we do it. Okay, are we good to go?
Good to go.
Awesome. So this first question here asks, have you ever been emotionally or physically abused by your partner or somebody who's important to you? And it's just yes or no, or you don't feel like answering.
Yes, I have.
Okay. And if you were, and you said yes, then the question is, was it by your spouse, partner, boyfriend, girlfriend?
A partner.
Okay. And was it within the last year?
No.
Okay. And any other family members ever?
Not that I can think of.
Okay. And it's asking about other members of your household. So is there anybody that you've ever lived with in the last year who was abusive that wasn't your partner or wasn't a family member?
No.
Okay, excellent. And anybody else within the last year, whether it was maybe not a friend, not a family member, not anybody living at home, but somebody in the community?
No.
Okay, awesome. So the next question asks, within the last year, have you ever been hit, slapped, kicked, or otherwise physically hurt by someone?
No.
Okay. And you know, we kind of asked that with the first question, but we just want to make sure we're getting it. Since you've been pregnant, have you been hit, slapped, kicked, or otherwise physically hurt by someone?
No.
Okay. And then the next question is, within the last year, has anyone forced you to have sexual activities?
No.
Okay. And the next question is, are you afraid of your partner or anyone who was listed above?
No, I'm not.
Excellent. So it sounds like overall for you, you're feeling pretty comfortable in your own home.
Yes.
You know that you're safe and that you're able to keep things safe around you.
I am. Pretty
Excellent.
As you reflect on this clip in the video, again, please consider what skills or strategies were used to follow the protocol and keep the screening warm, supportive. Was it conversational? Was it clear that there was respect from the home visitor to the family? Was it done in a way that was non-judgmental, that was open, that was transparent, that conveyed accurate empathy? Or did it come across as rote, stilted, judgmental, or completely disconnected from any feelings of empathy or warmth? What skills or strategies do you use to integrate screening as a natural part of a home visit? Take a moment to jot down a few ideas about strategies that you already use and want to continue to build upon. The next video shows what happens when you share results.
So Sophia, I wonder, thanks for giving me a chance to look back over it. I wonder, as you look back over it, are there any questions you have about this abuse assessment screen?
Not that I can think of, no.
Yeah. The one thing that really struck me is that for you, there was some abuse in the past.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't within the last year, and right now you're feeling pretty safe in your own home.
Yes.
Great. If there's ever an opportunity, something going on and you do need to talk about it, I just want you to know that I'm here, and if you need additional support, by all means, we're going to follow up and make sure you get that.
Okay.
So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take the screen back. I know that for you screened where there wasn't a concern, but in families where there is a concern, if we were to leave this around, it might be a hot spot issue that we want to avoid, so if it's cool, I'll just take it back. But if you ever have any questions, let me know. We can pull it back out of your file.
Sure.
All right. Thanks. So I guess the other thing I just want to check in, I know that you were working in your plan on being able to breastfeed, and it sounds like that's going well for you.
Yes, it's going very well.
Awesome. Awesome. That must feel really good.
It does.
So in this reflection, please consider, how did the home visitor send the message to the parent or guardian that the screening was more important than a required exercise or paperwork? What kind of follow-up do the parent, guardian, and home visitor each need to do, if any? And how might the information learned in this screening influence how a home visitor works with this parent or guardian? This next piece is around safety planning for the family. If somebody is still in the relationship, these resources are taken from the National Association Center for Domestic Violence. Blah. I need to redo this slide. So skip it back to the top. In the module now, we're going to think a little bit more together about safety planning for the family if someone is still in the relationship. Here are some key ingredients for a safety plan from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Some things that you can consider in a safety plan are a safe place to go if an argument occurs, and a way to be very intentional about avoiding rooms that have no exits, such as bathrooms, or avoiding rooms with weapons. It's also important in safety planning to think about and make a list of safe people to contact. Keep in mind that that safe list should be kept somewhere that's truly safe itself and will not be found by the person who has been committing the abuses. So that will vary from family to family and from woman to woman in terms of knowing what that safe place is. Make sure during the safety planning to really individualize those supports, and rather than going first to making suggestions in the safety planning about where a woman could keep that list of people to contact, really eliciting that from her. Another thing to keep in mind is to keep change with you at all times and to memorize those important numbers. Another key thing is to establish a code word or a sign that family, friends, teachers, or coworkers know when you call for help. It's also important when doing safety planning to think about, for the woman to think about what she'll say to a partner if that partner becomes violent. Again, written plans can be found by an abuser and trigger violence, so discussion-based planning is really, really important. It's also important to consider a safety plan for a family if someone has ended a relationship where there's been domestic violence. Violence can and often does occur even when a relationship is ended. So even though a woman may relay through the screening process that she is no longer in a violent relationship, there's some value in checking in and developing a safety plan. Here are some things that have worked for others and that are recommended by the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Changing phone numbers, paying attention in screening calls, saving and documenting all contacts, messages, injuries, or other incidents involving the person who's committed the battery, changing locks if the batterer has a key, avoiding staying alone, and planning how to get away if confronted by an abusive former partner, considering how to meet in a safe way with the former partner if that's required, and making sure to do that in a public place, varying routines, and notifying school and work contacts if you're experiencing ongoing threats or violence in the relationship with the ex. And the other thing to keep in mind is the ability to call a shelter for battered women and find out what additional resources exist to support the woman. So one of the things that can happen when somebody is doing screening and assessment around domestic violence and intimate partner violence is that it can bring up thoughts and feelings for the home visitor themselves. And so some questions that might be helpful to reflect about or to journal about are the following. How do you talk with someone experiencing domestic violence or intimate partner violence about change without sounding judgmental? This question prompt is important because it allows us to take our empathy and concern and desire for good outcomes for somebody experiencing domestic violence and hold that ground while at the same time not over-guiding and coming across as judgmental or demeaning or in control of what somebody will do in their own life. So thinking about it on the front end helps to identify and avoid triggers while in the process of doing the screening and assessment. Another question that can be helpful to journal about or to have a conversation with a supervisor about is the following. When someone is in survival mode or actively experiencing trauma, how do you support planning and problem solving? So it can be very challenging and frustrating to home visitors to try to move into planning function when that involves being able to process and think consequentially when somebody is actively experiencing trauma. And so coming up with strategies that will work for you are really important, because if you have some of those strategies in your toolbox when you're in the moment, it will be more helpful to the family. So when there's domestic and intimate partner violence, it can raise safety concerns for the home visitor as well. And so there are some things that home visitors can do with supervisors and with their agency to increase safety of the home visitor when they're working with families who are experiencing domestic and intimate partner violence. One is to understand your agency's domestic violence home visiting protocol. So another is that if domestic violence is disclosed by a client, to discuss with the supervisor whether or not it is safe to deliver home visiting services in the home. Because home visitors' safety matters too, it's important for home visitors to also create a safety plan. And here are some ideas of what might be topics for that safety planning. One is really considering timing and location and the possibility of meeting with a family or a parent at the office if the situation is not safe. I want to be clear that just because there's domestic violence or intimate partner violence in a home, that does not mean that it's never safe to conduct a home visit in someone's home. But it's important to have a conversation and to have strategies and a plan about how to know if it's not safe and another place needs to be established. And that really needs to happen in the context of a conversation between a home visitor and their supervisor, respecting the insights and best judgment of both, and coming up with that plan and alternatives for maintaining relationships and services with families if the home is truly unsafe. It's also important to consider timing related to check-ins and communication with a home office. So as home visitors are out in community going from visit to visit, it's important to have intentional check-ins that are honored and that are met to convey that the home visitor has left a home where there's domestic violence and is safe. Other strategies that have worked for people are parking with the front of their vehicle pointed toward the exit. So if there needs to be a quick exit, that the home visitor is able to do that, and that the vehicle is set up in a way to support that. It's also important to really pay attention and listen to your senses. So when home visitors come up to a home, it's important to observe and listen before entering the home. It's also important to not enter the home until you see the client at the door. It's helpful to position yourself near the door or the exit in the household, and to have emergency numbers in your cell phone and set onto auto dial. Always stay aware of your surroundings and look for behavioral clues. Many home visitors are expert at reading people and situations, so use that expertise not only for the benefit of the clients, but for the benefit of your own safety, and pay attention to warning signs of a dangerous situation. So another reflective exercise that can be really helpful when you're working with a family who has experienced domestic violence and you've completed abuse assessment screen and know that this is an issue, is to do a debrief with a colleague or supervisor. And here are some things that you might consider discussing during the debrief, or as ways to frame the debrief. What are your own beliefs and values about people experiencing domestic violence and intimate partner violence? What do you see, hear, feel, smell that might make you concerned about your safety during a home visit, and that you can pay attention to prior to entering a home? Another thing to think about is how you deal with screening an assessment around domestic violence in a way that allows you to keep your eye on the overall whole of the home visiting relationship rather than too narrowly focused on domestic violence. And so a question to consider in debriefing with a colleague or supervisor is, if you measured your professional success based on reducing isolation and increasing options for someone who is a victim of domestic violence, rather than measuring your professional success on whether or not they leave the abusive partner, how would that impact your job satisfaction? I want to acknowledge that there are many home visitors that already see their professional success in terms of increasing options and reducing isolation, but for those who still fill the pool of wanting to be able to be supportive enough and effective enough as a home visitor that people leave abusive situations, this is an opportunity to reframe your role and your work, and can be really, really powerful in terms of being able to show up with families who are experiencing domestic and intimate partner violence in a way that is grounded, present, authentic, and non-judgmental. So there are also some resources for supervisors, and that may be helpful to keep in mind. So supervisors, here's some things to consider. If you're going to screen for an issue like domestic or intimate partner violence, is your agency protocol and best practices clear to all direct line staff, and is it in place as a foundation for their practices? It's important to do this assessment both on your own and as a review, but it's also important to do this assessment of your agency protocols and the clarity of them with staff input. And these kinds of documents and policies and protocols are often a work in progress and are worth revisiting. So take this as an opportunity to consider a review and strengthening of your protocols. If you don't have a protocol, there is a great free resource to support your program in developing one. It's available online, and one of the things that it's based on is relationships with community partners. So again, strongly encourage you to reach out to local domestic violence experts for support in your protocol development. Additionally, ongoing training and support is important to reinforce home visitor confidence and competence, and there are some great training resources available at the Milwaukee Child Welfare Training Partnership related to domestic violence. You may also have some great resources through your local extension office or local community partners. So wherever you choose to go, know that domestic violence and intimate partner violence are not the kind of training that are one and done. They're the kind of training that requires ongoing conversation, thought, and reflection to really address these critically important and challenging issues with families in a way that is as supportive as possible. So, in order for staff to have some success in delivering the abuse assessment screen, it's important that they're well prepared. And some ways that they can be well prepared are by knowing the signs of vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, and compassion fatigue. If you know that yourself and you teach those signs to your team, you're going to be on the right track. At the end of this module, there's some resources that go in more depth around secondary trauma and compassion fatigue that you can use as a tool for yourself and with your team. It's also important to be very intentional about recruiting home visitors who have strong boundaries and who are comfortable bearing witness to and responding to disclosures of abuse and trauma. So, during the interview process, being very straightforward that 22% of families who have participated in Wisconsin's Family Foundation's home visiting program have disclosed a history of or current domestic violence or intimate partner violence is helpful. By having that very straightforward conversation, you can get a better insight into how a potential home visitor will respond to this topic, and you can be forthright with them so they can make a decision about whether or not this is a good fit. You can also teach and coach toward best practice standards for effectively screening for abuse and responding to abuse disclosures by having ongoing conversations and having ongoing simulations where colleagues conduct the screen with one another, or where staff conduct the screen with their supervisor and reflect and also receive feedback. So what is vicarious trauma? Vicarious trauma is a negative impact on professionals who work with people who have experienced trauma. Professionals may experience trauma if the person they serve has experienced trauma in related ways to the professional's own lived experiences. So we know that not only do people bring their tremendous training and education to their roles as home visitors, but that they also bring their lived experiences. And by having frank and open conversations about that in a supportive way, it's possible to minimize the effects of vicarious trauma. Compassion fatigue, which is also sometimes called vicarious traumatization or secondary traumatization, is defined as the emotional residue or strain of exposure to working with those suffering from the consequences of traumatic events. Now, it's different from burnout, but they can coexist, and compassion fatigue can occur due to exposure on one case, or it can be due to a cumulative effect of exposure to stories of trauma. Secondary trauma is the effect of traumatic contagion. It's the cost of caring, which is natural, predictable, treatable, and preventable. Compassion fatigue, or secondary traumatic stress, has nearly identical symptoms to post-traumatic stress disorder. And there may be a silencing response that comes about that interferes with the professional's ability to attend to the needs of the person they are serving if they're hearing stories and not having enough or high quality enough conversations that allow them to address their exposure to trauma in the screening process and in the home visiting process. So one of the things that home visiting professionals, both supervisors and frontline staff, can do is to be very much aware of the signs of secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. And according to the American Institute of Stress, these are some of the common signs: emotional exhaustion, reduced sense of personal accomplishment or meaning in the work, mental exhaustion, decreased interactions with others or isolation, and that can be showing up in the workplace or in the family, and depersonalization. Really, those symptoms that let us know that we're disconnected from the real causes of our compassion fatigue. And then another sign is physical exhaustion. So there are all tools available for helping professionals cope with secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. There's a professional quality of life scale. It's free. People can take it online or they can print out a copy. There's also some great strategies and a helper pocket card available to promote resiliency and prevent compassion fatigue. And there's also a self-care assessment worksheet that can not only help people understand where they're at with self-care, but also help people understand what some strategies are that have worked for others. Additionally, there needs to be an organizational response, not just a personal response. So practices such as reflective supervision can make a big difference. And being able to confidently refer people to an employee assistance plan or additional resources can be very useful. So let's go back to the recruiting of home visitors and some things that you can do to make sure that you find somebody who is a good fit for asking the difficult questions and having the meaningful conversations that come from screening and assessing around domestic violence. So during the interview process, like I said, be clear. Tell candidates that part of the job involves asking questions about people's experiences with abuse. And let those potential home visitors know that disclosures of abuse among participating families are not uncommon. Again, 22% of the women who responded to the screen and assessment in the 2014-15 fiscal year disclosed and screened positive for abuse. Also give candidates a few minutes to review the screen. Have it available during the interview process and ask them to role play administering the screen during the interview. Now, the goal here is not that people do it beautifully and without flaw. What you're really looking for in this is their ability to use or approach it in a way that's consistent with motivational interviewing spirit. Are they able to present it in a way that's conversational, that's taking your cues? Are they doing it in a way that conveys empathy and warmth and non-judgment? If they're doing those things and they're on the right track, if you're not seeing those ingredients in their approach, then it may not be a good fit. There are also some sample interview questions, and here's some suggestions that might work for you or give you some ideas for questions of your own during the interview process to make sure that you're really finding someone who's a good fit to do this important task of home visiting. So you could say something like, using a screening tool, how would you approach asking questions about a parent's history of abuse? Or, if someone discloses significant abuse, how will you show compassion and still keep the focus on the parent's needs and interests rather than your own reactions? Or, how might knowing about a parent's abuse history help you work with them more effectively as a home visitor? And another suggestion is that you might ask is, if you heard something during screening that was disturbing to you, how would you address your own feelings and needs about what you heard? So all of those questions will give you insight into a home visitor candidate's reflective capacity, problem-solving skills, and ability to be people-centered. It's also really important to consider, as a supervisor, ways that you're going to be orienting new staff. So some things to keep in mind during orientation are discussing the amount of domestic violence and other forms of abuse in Wisconsin families and families in your caseload. So while you may take the suggestion and raise the statistic in your hiring process, there's a lot to process in a hiring process. So it's helpful to share that data, use that as a way to keep some context about domestic violence. Also, it's important that home visitors understand the impacts of domestic violence on child development. You also want to schedule attendance at the next training on domestic violence or the abuse assessment screen. Look for opportunities with UW-Milwaukee Child Welfare Training Partnership and/or from your local partners. Introduce new staff to people in the community who work on domestic violence issues and help them bridge those relationships. Share and review the abuse assessment screen tip sheet with new home visitors or home visitors expressing discomfort with administering the screen. The first time administering the screen should not be with a home visiting family. It should be in multiple role plays with a supervisor or colleagues. You'd also benefit in the orientation from providing those multiple role play opportunities sometime within the first 90 days of employment. And it's also really important to support safety planning with clear expectations and agency policies and protocols about what to do if a home visitor feels unsafe. In order to address the needs and concerns that come about with screening around domestic violence, reflective practices can be very, very instrumental to maintaining somebody's effectiveness and motivation to do this work well. So, in a reflective approach, discuss feelings and reactions to administering the abuse assessment screen with the home visitors during staff meetings or during one-on-one supervision. Listen without judgment. Explore if any of the reflective exercises or other reflective activities might help process delivery of the screen. The supervisor and home visitor can also consider together the implications of screening results on service delivery and add ideas to case notes. They can also identify staff who are comfortable and effective in delivering the screen and pair them with colleagues who may be more challenged by this screen, so that way they practice skills. It's also really important for supervisors to consider administration and quality issues with the screening and assessment related to domestic violence and partner violence. So monitoring the completion of the abuse assessment screen and using the home visiting data collection table can help to make sure that all women who are participating and who are eligible are getting that opportunity to have these meaningful conversations. Monitoring documentation of the screening results and sphere, at least quarterly for newly enrolled families, really help to see that those timelines are met and that the appropriate follow-up is occurring. By analyzing the data to see if there are any trends in completion rates, documentation of follow-up, and family outcomes, the supervisor can understand if there are additional needs around professional development or one-on-one coaching to home visitors who may be more challenged by conducting this screen. The supervisor and home visitor can consider together the implications of screening results on service delivery and again add those ideas to the case notes. There are some great resources out there related to home visitors and domestic violence. So there's a domestic violence protocol template that's available for free. You can download it and work on that with community partners who are also expert in domestic violence. There's a copy of the summary research on the abuse assessment screen for those of you who are interested. You can also find domestic violence resources in Wisconsin online, as well as sexual assault survivor services in Wisconsin, as well as some information and additional learning related to same-sex domestic violence in the United States. Again, if you have any questions about this module, please feel free to contact Lily Irvin Vitella via email, LinkedIn, or via cell phone.